Hey, my name is David Ruybalid, and I am a podcaster. Used to be, back in the
Mm.
day, I was a blogger and writer. I actually am a pastor currently, though that is quite a story. What led me that direction. But I was born and raised in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and I was raised in a Christian home. And so it is one of those ones that goes back deep through both sides. So both of my grandfathers were pastors. And then even on my dad's side, his grandfather was actually in a region known as the San Luis Valley. He was like the first Catholic to Protestant convert in like this entire valley that's about the size of Israel. And when he converted, he became like an evangelist hardcore and planted a church eventually with a few other families, and that church is still in existence. I actually was just there. I swung by there driving from Colorado Springs. I live in Phoenix, Arizona now. The other day, yeah, so that was a trip swinging by there. But Christianity is like deeply rooted, and having two grandfathers that were pastors, I grew up bouncing between Christian school and homeschooling. And when I would homeschool, I spent a lot of time with my grandfathers, both that were pastors. And so there's something in my DNA, something in my blood that just kind of was used to the systems and the way all that stuff has worked.
Mm.
Now, what's unique about my story is being raised in Colorado Springs. It's kind of the mecca of evangelical Christianity, and so I was raised in the '90s specifically. That was kind of I was born '84 in Colorado Springs, but in the '90s, my childhood, like Focus on the Family, just moved in, and a bunch of ministries were coming into Colorado Springs. And so there were going to Christian school. I went to one of the largest Christian schools for a while. I didn't graduate from there, but for a while, one of the largest Christian schools on the Front Range. So that's from like Wyoming down to New Mexico. And in there, we had famous baseball players' kids, famous authors' kids, famous musicians, Christian
Mm.
musician kids there. And so that Christian subculture was tight. I mean, they when I transitioned to a different Christian school, they actually would record classroom noise for Adventures in Odyssey there in my school.
Oh,
And I
fun.
went to school with a guy who played a couple of the Adventures in Odyssey characters and stuff. And so that was kind of my upbringing. But one of the things that was really unique, even within that world, and that's unique to the way many people grow up, just because of how
Yeah.
just evangelical celebrity like culture I was around. The church that I grew up in was a Christian fundamentalist church. Now, when I say fundamentalist, a lot of times over the last 5 to 8 years, fundamentalism has kind of been adopted as a way of saying like conservatively, biblically rigid.
Yeah.
But what I was raised in was even past that. It was cultish. It was, there's a couple documentaries out right now. One is on Amazon. It's Shiny Happy People, and it talks
Mm.
about kind of the Duggars upbringing and stuff. That's one of the documentaries that highlights kind of the world in which I was raised in. The other one is Let Us Pray, which is on Max. That's another one. And it's highly abusive, highly authoritarian, highly called to submit to authority, called to submit to the male pastor, called to submit to the husband and the father in a way that is those passages are used as weapons to
Mm.
abuse. And I mean, I remember kids telling me the way their parents would discipline them. I remember hearing from one kid that his parents bent him over and hit him with a 2x4. I remember hearing stories of parents telling each other how to discipline in ways that wouldn't leave marks. And so it
Mm.
was like this like highly high control religious environment,
Yeah.
connected to like Bob Jones University, Pensacola, some of those schools that, I mean, Bob Jones up until 2000 didn't even allow interracial dating. And so it's
Oh,
like
wow.
this, it's past just conservative evangelicalism into cultish behavior, cultish systems, cultish tendencies. And that's how I was raised.
Mm.
Going to Bible camp, going to the altar, even sometimes not even knowing why I was going, but I was so dysregulated from, being a
Yeah.
kid with the speaker at camp yelling at us and, hellfire and brimstone. I'm so dysregulated inside that I'm like, I'm going to the altar, even though like I didn't really have anything to really confess. And so it was a really abusive, world I was raised in. And kind of a few major traumatic events that kind of stuck in me through unprocessed trauma. The first was my parents were one of the first families in the history of our church to go through a divorce. And in that, there's a few things that happened. The church didn't know as a kid of divorced parents really how to help me. Some people with good intentions would kind of overtalk, just always feel like they had to talk about it and kind of bring me, over talk about my feelings and stuff where I didn't want to. I just wanted to be a kid. And so it was kind of like the awkwardness of the adults trying to be helpful in those scenarios. Another thing was that in it all, because of the system of patriarchy and kind of extreme, male dominance, instead of people helping my parents work together and heal, it just turned into kind of the abusive for my mom. Why are you not submitting to your husband? That's the true problem here. And so I'm seeing that kind of unravel of the wrestle with my mom in that environment. And so I stepped away from church for about a year, and I struggled. But it was kind of friends. I had really good friends that kind of brought me back around to coming to church. Now, if you hold that thought, let me share one other thing that happened kind of within that period of time is I was sexually abused in that context as well. And what that did was, when you're in a high control environment with shame and a lot of denial of emotions, I just didn't have a place to bring it. I didn't have a place to talk about it. I couldn't be open about it. And I don't blame myself for that now, looking back on it, because the environment I was in just didn't allow itself for a safe place to do so. And so those are kind of the two things side by side in that environment that really, really, I think had a major impact on me. I was there when my parents went through divorce. My dad, so I lived with my mom and my dad when they separated before the divorce was final. My dad moved out, and then eventually my mom became a deputy sheriff and was able to kind of support herself, and she moved out and my dad moved back in. So I was living with my dad. And in a rigid fundamentalist background, kind of like how I was raised, there's just certain things you don't do. So one of the, of course, alcohol is not something you participate in. So, I didn't really know anybody that were Christians that drank alcohol. So that was a big one. The other one is rock music. And so, and that even includes Christian rock. And so Christian contemporary music is seen in those environments as like you're compromising. You're trying to be like the world, is kind of how it's seen. And so that kind of created some issue growing up, even in Christian schools, where they're listening to DC Talk at the time, they're listening to Newsboys, and I wasn't even allowed to listen to that. Well, I didn't know this, but my dad in the 70s worked in a record store, and he never talked about it because we were fundamentalists. Well, I started getting into music and obsessed with music. I was in jazz band. I was in pep band. I began to learn the drums, which that was something we couldn't really talk about at my church. Here I am learning the drums. And my dad, I learned that he worked for a record store, and then he brought down his record albums that I didn't even know he had a box of in storage at my great aunt's house across town. He brought those, and he began to connect with me. I think he realized that the best way he could connect with me, because we were kind of disconnected up to this point, was through music. And so I saw this turn in my dad, where from kind of fundamentalist Christian guy, he's putting on VH1 and he's like, hey, this is Jimi Hendrix, and watch him light his guitar on fire. He's like, tell me all these things. And I'm like, Dad, how do you know this stuff? It's like, and we connected and bonded through music. And in that time, he took me to go see Bob Dylan and Paul Simon. He took me to go see the Eagles. And so I'm beginning to enjoy music, and I'm beginning to enjoy this connection of music with my dad, but I couldn't talk about it at church. It was weird. It was like this non-sinful double life, like I can't talk about the music I'm into when I'm at my church. And that was kind of a moment where things began to shift, because when I entered high school, my best friend, Brad Knight, he just moved in from Omaha, Nebraska, became my best friend. He was a drummer, and a really talented and accomplished drummer. I was a drummer, but not at that level. And he would practice like 5 hours a night. He'd get home from school and just practice. And so I started getting into the band at my school. So I'd play music at my school. And Brad eventually went to New Life Church, which was a church in Colorado Springs, where if you follow Ted Haggard, if you know who he is, that was his church. Now, Ted Haggard, a couple years ago, there was a giant scandal where he was caught with a male prostitute, outed by the male prostitute, and was buying meth from him. But that was a church that we moved from. I moved out from fundamentalism into this church. And these are all musicians that I kind of built community with, that were playing the type of music that I enjoyed, just doing it in a church setting. And they were breaking molds out of that ministry. I mean, from that time, you have like I Am Free that the Newsboys did. I used to work for Daniel Bashta, who's written, he wrote God's Not Dead, that song that all the 10 movies are made off of. And Jared Anderson, well, he has a ton of songs, including like The Great I Am that's come out. So I moved from the fundamentalist world into that world in high school and started playing music semi-professionally. And what it was where I began to question some of the things in which I was raised, was that was a church that believed that all of the gifts of the Holy Spirit are still active and present. And the church I was raised in didn't. And so I started asking questions. And when I would ask questions of the people like my parents, or the people in the community that I was raised in, they wouldn't want to talk with me about it. They would just say, we're not talking about that. It just is the way it is. And that was the first time I began to be like, okay, if you don't want to answer my questions, what else is happening that you're just trying to protect? And so that's kind of where the beginning phases of my questions began. I was 17 years old. I'm seeing that this church that I went to, I'm able to have the freedom to play different types of music in, is practicing their faith differently. And the people that I was raised with didn't want to talk about it. And so that began to push me to be like, I'm going to start asking some more questions. And I graduated high school. And after I graduated high school, there was a church in Woodland Park, Colorado, which is this little town outside of Colorado Springs, that decided to take me on as an intern. And I had a relationship with them. And I was beginning to wrestle with some of the Christian subculture stuff of Colorado Springs and stuff. And so I liked working with kids and youth, and so I was an intern within the youth department there. But over time, it's like they saw something in me that I didn't quite see or want, because I liked playing music, and they said, "Hey, we think you have the potential of being a pastor." And I'm like, "You guys are crazy." And they're like, "We want to invest in you. We want to send you to school." And I didn't want it, but I wasn't mature enough to have the conversation that wasn't something I wanted. And so in my immaturity, I called up a Bible college that offered me a really good scholarship if I just sang for them. And it's the same one my dad went to, my sister went to, my grandparents went to, my uncles and aunts went to. And so I called up the advisor and said, "Is that scholarship still on the table?" I found the last place that the ACT tests were available to, and 3 weeks before classes started, I signed up for classes and went. And it was kind of my way of running, but I didn't think through that this school is more in it wasn't a Bob Jones or Pensacola, but it was more in the vein of the type of like Christian beliefs and practices of how I was raised. And when I went there, I struggled. I began to question like everything. I questioned the subculture things that they were into Christian wise. I questioned. I was in Old Testament survey and New Testament survey. I questioned all the ways in which they would read specific passages. I could pick apart the professor's ideas and thoughts. And I got really frustrated because I felt like the students were just drinking the Kool-Aid and falling in line and not really thinking through it all. And so I just got really, really frustrated because I didn't feel like there was a place where anybody was thinking and asking questions, and I didn't think there was a place for my questions. And so after a year of being there, I decided to move back to Colorado, and I called up a musician friend of mine who hired me to play for him, and I moved back to Colorado. And that's where I kind of went full force into the beginning stages of about a decade-long intense deconstruction process. And so that's kind of where it started. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. You were mentioning like just throughout your whole story, there are all these instances where you weren't able to speak up. You didn't feel comfortable enough to speak up. Post parents' divorce, all these adults keep talking to you, giving their input, and just kind of silencing and making you kind of go into a shell. And then sexual abuse, and then again, I don't know how I can bring this up in this environment. And then throughout your growing up, you're like, oh, just continual silencing, blowing out your candle, blowing out the light. And I'm just, and then from what I'm gathering, it sounds like you were a little bit even pressured to kind of go into a ministry because that's just the culture around you.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until you left where you were off to college, granted a Christian college that someone back home sent you to, that's when you were like, I'm going to start asking these questions. And now I'm free. I had to leave this environment to then ask more questions. And then ultimately you find your way on this deconstruction journey. And so I think it's very interesting. But I want to even talk about a little bit about the sexual abuse side, because I feel like you've glanced over it. But I don't know if you know a little bit about my story, but I also was a victim of sexual abuse from my older brother. And so I can understand where that you don't feel comfortable enough to bring it up at a young age. And so I want to dive into a little bit about that. It's like not feeling safe enough to bring it up at church, because I can definitely relate to that as well. For me, in my story, it's church was that safe space for me to go, where I wasn't at home, where I wasn't being abused. So I didn't want to bring it up. Now, in the moment, I didn't know that's what I was doing. But looking back and going through therapy and being more informed about my trauma, I didn't want to bring it up in that situation. I didn't want to ask for help because of that shame. I didn't want the people where I found safety at, I didn't want them to judge me.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to your point of when you brought up your parents being divorced, I didn't want adults coming in and just telling me, here's how you should feel.
Yeah.
And so let's dive into a little bit of that experience for you.
Yeah. What would be helpful, you think?
I think just understanding how you reflect on that moment in your life and you
Mm-hmm.
look at all the things you did to kind of quote survive.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that, like as I said, there's a lot of misconceptions around it of, well, why didn't you just say something?
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
can even relate to sexual abuse, but any type of abuse, domestic abuse, religious abuse as well. Just diving into that construct where people have a lot of misconceptions of, why didn't you just say something? Why didn't you just speak up? It's like, it's not that easy. It's not that simple.
Yeah, I would say that is a common way, that question, intentionally or unintentionally, what it does is it actually re-victimizes the victim. So I will say, if you're listening to this and ever you're at a place where somebody comes out about allegations, please don't ever ask, well, why did you wait until now to say something? Because there's an entire process where a person will only do it when they feel ready or safe to do so. And so we see that, we see that in different political interactions over the last 10 years with different political figures and justices, where it's like, there's rape allegations or whatever, and they're like, well, why did you say this now? This is all political now. Be really, really careful if you're listening to this. If allegations come out from somebody, never to say, well, why are you saying this now? Why did it take years? I've seen that over and over. In my story, people have asked that question. Sometimes people are just curious, like they really want to know. But other times it's a way of questioning the testimony. For me, there were a lot of things wrapped up. I don't really want to get in the details for the sake of, not everybody knows every detail of my story who's close to me. But I will say that in the instance that I was kind of talking about and sharing here, he was a Sunday school teacher whose dad was the head of the elder board for like 30 years. And the dad, they used to call the elder boards, like they would call them the good men. It was like so cultish, like the good men have decided, the good men.
Yeah.
And so in my head, church leaders are just not somebody you challenge or approach. The other piece, without over talking it, just out of fairness for my family and respect for my family, there are family dynamics that are more than generational. Some of it is cultural. Without getting into all the dynamics, where I've had to wrestle with the sense that of denial, of emotions, that is just a part of the environment that I was raised around. And so you're denied the ability to feel, to grieve, to hurt. Nothing in some of the environments I was raised, nothing is wrong with this world, or we're not going to talk about what's wrong with this world. We're just going to be happy. I mean, that's why the documentary is called Shiny Happy People, right? I mean, like everything's just hidden behind a veneer of, nonsense.
Yep.
And so when you're in a place of denial, you're, and then it breeds shame that's pushed down, while also breeds this false happiness, which also breeds religiously what we call spiritual bypassing. And so instead of you walking through the pain and trying to figure out God within it, God is only found in the happiness and resolve, so be happy. And so I was never really given myself, let alone anyone was given me, permission to experience pain and hurt and so that was a lot of it. And so because of that, as a kid, um, yeah, you survive. A childhood trauma is when the definition is when you process things that you don't have the tools to process with alone as a child. Kids aren't given the tools, and when you're raised in a high control religious environment, you definitely aren't given the tools. And when your parents are marriage is struggling, and they're putting a lot of their energy in trying to figure that out, you're not given the tools. You don't have what's called co-regulators in trauma talk. You don't have co-regulators to sit and walk through that stuff with you. When you're in a Christian school that is scared of the sexual wrestles that people have because of the brokenness, and if you talk about your struggle, all of a sudden, especially for millennials, older millennials that were in teenagers in the late 90s and 2000s, you get called gay, or you get called all the, and so like you can't talk about it in those scenarios. Like,
Yeah.
there's no nuanced approach for, like, even my abuse. I look back on it, and my abuse actually caused me in high school to question my sexuality and my sexual desires, because I'm like, well, it happened to me and I have like weird thoughts. What do I do with it? I had nobody to take it to. um you know and even today, I was on staff at a Christian school for 2 years, and I do not support now, looking through multiple things I've wrestled with them. I don't support how even they, one of the top Christian schools in the nation, handle kids with complex struggles because of these things. And so I don't trust Christian environments, even now as an adult looking back, to handle students that are wrestling with these things. And so as a kid, you don't feel safety, so you do everything you can to not create waves.
Yeah.
And as an adult, I look back, I'm like, there wasn't a safe environment. Like 9 out of 10 Christian environments are not safe environments for these things. We have to do better. And so that was a lot of the struggle. I had to survive. With trauma, you adapt to survive, and then the way you learn to function even as an adult, because it comes embodied in you, is the sum of your adaptations for survival. So
Yeah. That's good. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
And yeah, you left off in your story of going off to do music semi-professionally, and
Yeah.
then you deconstructed for quite a bit of period. I think you said 10 years.
Yeah.
And so how do you go from there to where you are now,
Mm-hmm.
as your Instagram bio says, a trauma-informed pastor, I believe, and you're bringing up all these terms, even in just that short snippet here of talking about abuse. And so I'm curious, how do you go from fundamentalist and occult-like environment to deconstructing, just going into rock and roll, and then now as a trauma-informed pastor who is pretty outspoken, as you just mentioned, 9 out of 10 Christian environments not being safe, and then being a pastor in a Christian environment, which I would assume, based off of our short conversation and me following you for a little bit, is you want to create that safe environment. You want to help cultivate areas where people with their trauma can come and in a healthy ways find help outside of just like spiritually bypassing. And so what was that journey for you like to get where you are
Mm-hmm.
today?
Yeah, it was rough because inside of me, I'm always balancing tensions of contexts currently. I say that, being a pastor at a church while also working with, victims and survivors, and speaking honestly and sometimes very directly about things. There's all
Yeah.
these different contextual tensions, but I think I didn't navigate them well in my 20s. we use a term window of tolerance. If you're familiar with kind of that inside of us, there is the it's our nervous system that's always reacting when we're triggered or dysregulated. And so as we heal, we begin to build what's called a window of tolerance, to where certain things that would send us off the rails no longer send us off the rails anymore. And so I think there was a lot of healing that took place in those 10 years. And then there was a lot of healing in the last 5 years of my life that took place. Now, kind of the process of what happened. So I started playing music, and I started playing professionally, like all over the place, bars, clubs, studio. I ran a studio, just to share a little bit of my musical journey in here. So I ran a studio with one of my best friends from high school, Jeremy Unruh. And one of the partners we had that worked with us specifically on one big project, but that kind of was part of our ecosystem in the studio, is Jared Bettis. And Jared Bettis, who raised in Colorado Springs. Well, just to throw back to the Christian school world, I went to school with multiple members of different bands. One of those, I went to school with two of the members of One Republic. So Ryan Tedder, and then the person who hired me to work for him, moved me back to Colorado Springs, is Mark Tedder, who is Ryan's uncle. And so the original drummer from One Republic is a guy by the name of Jared Bettis, and he's kind of the one that was a part of our ecosystem. And he was for about a year until he moved back. After he left One Republic, he worked with us, and then he moved back to LA to work. Ryan started a label under Interscope Records. And he went back. So he's the guy who drummed on Adele's 21 album. He wrote, he got a Grammy and I think an Emmy Award because he wrote The Lonely Island, the I Just Had Sex, that song.
Okay.
Yeah. So he, anyway, so he went back to Hollywood, kind of do the big stuff, but he was kind of a part of our ecosystem a little bit. And while I was doing that, I was introduced to Brad Knight, who I mentioned him earlier. He was the drummer that was like my best friend in high school.
Yeah.
He, over time, he was Lincoln Brewster's drummer, if you know who he is. He was the Desperation drummer, and he toured with all these different artists. Well, one of the ones that he started getting involved with was Michael Gungor, if you know who Michael Gungor is.
Yep.
So it's from Gungor. Well, Michael and Lisa just moved from Michigan to Denver when I was working there, and I was newly married, and Brad's like, hey, why don't you come up and just come hang out with us? So I went up to a night of worship in Denver that they called Bloom. And while I was there, they met me, and there was enough chemistry to where they kept calling me for stuff. And so they didn't want to bring in the sound guy from the last Bloom. So in my little Chevy Malibu, I brought in, full system subwoofers, 24 like it's all shoved in my Malibu. I'm driving down the road, and so I'm building PA systems for them, running PA. Then I started drumming for them, and started helping with this kind of worship movement they were doing in Denver called Bloom. And so I was around them as Beautiful Things was written. I actually drummed the first night. I was a drummer the first night Beautiful Things was ever played live. And so if you listen to that album, I was around that community and around those songs. Some of those songs I played for the first time for different reasons in different contexts. And so something about being around Mike and Lisa, if you know them, they're very, it was just a breath of fresh air. I could bring questions and say I don't buy certain things. I'm like, I don't buy that, or here's my struggle with that. And if you know Mike, I don't agree with everything that where he landed, but I'll say that he's one of the smartest people and most thoughtful people that I know. And so because of that, we're able to spin and look at different angles of different things that I was wrestling with. And so that was a huge part of my process of like, I found a community of people that are attempting to figure out Jesus, but in a way where questions and doubts and wrestles were not, I wasn't being judged for them. I could actually be honest about them.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the start of it. And in that, he told me, he's like, hey, why don't you read this book? And he handed me, it was N.T. Wright's Surprised by Hope, if you're familiar with that book, Surprised by Hope.
Yeah.
And up until this point, like I was at a church for a little while on contract, 6,000 member church in Colorado Springs when I first moved back from Bible college, part of it for the paycheck. At a church where Jerry Jenkins, if you know who Jerry Jenkins is, he wrote Left Behind with Tim LaHaye.
Oh, okay.
And so Jerry Jenkins was, and so if you understand Left Behind, it's the concept of like you're waiting for the rapture to happen, and you know, and I read N.T. Wright's Surprised by Hope, where he's basically saying, hey, that whole concept isn't even 200 years old, and bringing a whole different, deeper perspective to where God is bringing our world. It just blew my mind, and I grabbed hold of it. In those days, N.T. Wright, there was a website out there that somebody pieced together, and they put like every N.T. Wright lecture, every essay he did on the, and so I was like downloading them and just eating them all up. At this time, this was around the time of the big housing crash. And so at a certain point in time, people went from hiring musicians for all sorts of things and studio time to nobody had money for anything. And here I am, a professional musician, and I'm like, I don't know what to do. And so honestly, a church that I was contracting with, where I would just get paid per week, I talked into bringing me on with enough hours to give me health insurance. And then we wound up having, my wife and I got married, and then we wind up having a kid. And if you remember that 2006 to 2009 period with our economy, it was rough. Like people were living out of their vans. Like it was rough. And I saw the writing on the wall that if I didn't figure something out, then my family was in trouble. I mean, we were eating like the off brand of everything. And so to fast forward, I wound up in San Jose, California at a full-time worship leader position, but it was at a church that knew that I was wrestling with stuff, and they were actually open to me being there as a worship leader and to be honest from the platform, kind of like at Bloom, be honest from the platform about stuff that I was wrestling with. And so they weren't shocked when I was like, yeah, I don't know what I think about this whole biblical inerrancy thing, or I don't know what I think. Like, they weren't shocked by it. They weren't like, we got to get this guy out. You know, they kind of just allowed me to be them within their system and way of doing things. And they were open creatively to some wacky stuff. Like, I remember one time, we're like, how do we get people to understand the concept of King of Kings? We're like, well, what about King of Beers? And so like we in our church, we decorated with like Budweiser everywhere and stuff. So they were pretty open to just me figuring things out. And what it did was it created an environment where I think I felt safe enough at a moment to come out about my sexual abuse. And so when I was 25, I opened up about it for the first time to my pastor and then to my wife, and he gave me time off, and then the church paid for 2 years of my counseling through, and that was kind of where I began to open up. And in that, I began going to a recovery group and to work through all kinds of unhealthy ways that I learned to cope, to survive, that became addictive habits. And so that kind of played in there. And what I realized was that my deconstruction wasn't just an intellectual thing. That's kind of how I pinned it up into this point. But it was the trauma that I experienced being in a spiritually abusive environment and experiencing sexual abuse in that environment where my system in Christian environments was telling me to question all the things. So it was moving from a nervous system dysregulated response into a cognitive question all the things. And that was kind of like the first time I realized that those two things were hand in hand. And I was honest about it. I mean, that pastor, he left to Michigan and a new pastor came in, and he was a guy who's still a guy that I could be honest with. But I remember I had to tell him right away, just because out of honesty, he was hired. I remember sitting down and telling him, I'm like, I just want to let you know, because you're a pastor and because I'm really skeptical in Christian spaces and of Christian leaders, I don't trust you. And I just said, I just want you to know that as we work together here, I have to figure that out. But I just want to say out loud that I'm struggling trusting you. And so I told him that. And, but yeah, I wrestled with all kinds of things. I remember going on a retreat with some friends, and I would get dysregulated with Christian music. I would get dysregulated with Christian movies. I had a hard time while I'm leading worship at a church. I had a hard time when families would be like, yeah, we went to go see the Newsboys last night. And I'm like, because here I'm, one part of my story, I'm working for this church, but I'm also playing music on the side. And so I'm like working with old Bill Graham bands and working with like old Doobie Brothers members and David Crosby. I mixed a song with David Crosby. I'm working with guys who worked with like Yellow Card and like, so I'm like in this Bay Area music system that has nothing to do with Christian music, and all these people in Christian environments are dysregulating me as they're talking about their thing. And so I realized that, I had a long way still to go. To fast forward, let me fast forward a little bit. I really honestly wanted to get out of church ministry. And I was going in and out of seeing if music would take me there. And in 2013, I announced on January 1st of 2013 that I was going to be putting out a new album. I had tried putting out one in 2006, got signed by a record label that dropped me, and just kind of held off for a while. And I just said, you know what, I'm going to try putting out an album. Well, the minute I announced it online, I had people lining up, which led to 5 major label conversations, and one cool indie label conversation, multiple radio promotion people that I was talking to. And I'm like, oh, maybe this is it. Like, this is the time in which I am going to step out of doing church ministry and go to music full time. As I was negotiating these deals, I wasn't a fan of where it would put me financially. If you understand the way things work, when you sign a record deal, you're basically taking out a glorified loan, and they work you off, and they keep all of the profits from your CD sales until it's paid off. So you only keep any other merch you sell and your honorariums. And I was like, nah, like none of these deals, I'm going to be taking out basically a $30,000 to $60,000 loan with these companies and having to pay it off. And they're going to work me hard. I'm not going to see my family. Yeah. So I called up Brad Knight, that guy I told you about. And I was like, what will you do for me? And I had done him so many favors over the years where he's like, I'll tell you what, I'll do your project for $1,700. Which was like unreal. And he's like, he's like, that'll also include Chad, who will do all of the instrumentation stuff that we're not doing. And so Chad Carruthers is his name. He's a Nashville guy who plays for like Amberlin, and really cool guy. He's like, it'll include him, and we'll do your single for you for free if you give us co-write. So I was like, sweet, let's do it. So I crowdfunded and got it fully paid off. I paid for my own radio promotion, got in radio stations all over the nation. And what it did was it got different attention on me. And so I was like, okay, this is the time I need to explore leaving this church ministry. And so I sat down with the pastor that I was working with, and I just said, hey, I need to consider leaving And he was really cool. He said, I'll give you a year. He said, you can fly out, you could pursue anything you want to pursue, but a year from now, you just need to tell me if you're in or out. If you're in, we'll give you a raise and we'll rework your, your job position. If you're out, then we'll talk about moving you on. So we had that conversation, and I got on an airplane literally the next day with my family to come here to Arizona on vacation to visit my parents because they live here. And they attend a church called Cornerstone, or they were at the time, and they're like, hey, let's go to church. Well, I went to their church with them, and turns out I knew the guy who was leading worship through the circles over the years, and I also knew the guy that was there before for like 10 years, because like he runs the Passion Worship conferences now and stuff, and he runs Catalyst and stuff. And so I knew that guy, and so I had conversations with some of their staff while I was there, realized I knew them, and I the next morning, it was a Monday morning, I'm in the swimming pool and I get a phone call, and they're like, hey, do you want to talk about a job? And I told them no. I was like, no, I don't. And my flight that was supposed to go out that day got canceled, and they talked me into coming in the next day for an interview. And so I went in the next day, and basically I told him, I said, I want some sort of position where I can play music outside of the walls of the church with utter freedom, and make music with utter freedom, but still serve when I'm here and help when I'm here. And they didn't seem shocked by what I asked. And so they offered me a position that was like an artist in residence position, where they gave me access to recording studio. They gave me access to all of their resources, and they said, hey, you can go play music. You can go do your music thing. But when you're in town, you just play for us. And they paid me a salary for it. I'm like, this is awesome. Like, this is great. And so anyway, so I was doing this for a couple months and realized that there were a lot of like older high school and college age kids that weren't getting attention that they needed to get. Nobody was like walking through life with them. And so I decided I would start meeting with them. And as I was meeting with them, it started growing from like 15 to 20 to 30 once a week we're meeting. And our communications director was like, hey, I think you're called to be a pastor. I was like, you are crazy. I am not called to be a pastor. That's the last thing I want. And she talked me into going to our lead pastor. And he said, I affirm it. I think you're actually called to be a pastor. And so I decided that I would submit to a process of discernment for that. And it was about a 2-year process. And to fast forward, in that process, I began digging into theology. I had kind of stayed away from the T word a little bit because, I just didn't care up until that point. So I started digging into theology and realized that I started wrestling with more stuff. More layers began to kind of deconstruct. And some of those had to do with like the character of God, the whole concept of God's anger, God's wrath, all that stuff. What does that mean? Is his default that he's angry and he just needs to take out his anger on, and he demands blood, but then he abused his son on the cross. And so I started wrestling with the caricatures of penal substitutionary atonement. I started picking all those things apart, and then I started to publicly write about them. And began really quickly that there were thousands of people that began to resonate with some of the stuff that I was saying and doing. And that's when it hit me. I'm like, oh, like I'm not alone in these wrestles. And there's a lot of other people trying to figure this stuff out. And so in that period of time, I mean, I lost friends. There were ministry friends that, I mean, I was called a false teacher. I was called a heretic. I was called all sorts of things because I was being publicly honest about, just saying things like, first of all, I don't agree with, like, let's just say, one of the concepts is eternal conscious torment. In the
Mm.
I don't agree with how I was raised. So let me publicly talk about other options I'm wrestling with, and I would do it. And what wound up happening was it would cause people that were questioning and wrestling to lean in, while also frustrating the people that wanted to not have me question it. And so
Yeah.
I would say that 2016, 2017 range, I really, really started questioning some of those character of God that led into atonement, that led into afterlife type questions in that.
Mm.
And what was interesting was the church I was at, even though they're super conservative, I don't know if the lead pastor just let it happen or they didn't like it, but they didn't talk to me about it. But they still ordained me, and so they ordained me as a pastor. And right afterwards, Christian school asked if I would consider taking a full-time Bible position, and they knew that I like they what was interesting about them, they would bring me into some of the classes sometimes to kind of mess with the kids. And so like, like they'd have scenarios like like there's a lesbian couple that just came to know Jesus. Would you baptize them? And you have all them like wrestling with it. And I would come in and just blow them up and be like, well, why wouldn't you? And just like, just blow them up with all these things and other scenarios that they would come up with in some of these debates. And so the school kind of knew that I was kind of a feather ruffler, and I think they kind of wanted it in the Bible department a little bit. And so that was happening. And then my brother-in-law, he's like, hey, I'm out in California. I want you to join me. I'm going to really try and speed this up just for the sake of landing the plane for you. But I was at a church where they left an Episcopal, so a mainline Episcopal. They left that denomination and came under the Anglican churches in North America. So the Anglican church was receiving my ordination, and so I was going to be ordained within the Anglican church. But they were a congregation that had never really thought outside of themselves. So you had a bunch of really wealthy old people that didn't realize that the world has changed since mid-century. And they said they wanted change. They wanted to reach people. And my brother-in-law started getting in there. And, I was super creative with how I did it. And it just made them really uncomfortable. And so eventually they had my brother-in-law fired. And it was just a matter of time before I was gone. And I would say that I have experienced abuse from church leader as a congregant. That was the first time I ever experienced abuse at that level as a leader from the congregation. And it was horrible. And in that time, I considered leaving. And there was a church in Colorado Springs, a very prominent Presbyterian church that was talking to me. And about taking over their worship ministry. So I flew out, and while I was out there, it was almost like, I'm so thankful it happened. They took on the Nashville Statement the weekend I was out there. If you're familiar with the Nashville Statement, it's a very rigid statement around sexuality and gender. And in that, specifically in that, they say that a person's gender is based on their chromosomes. Well, I'm wrestling with this because within that denomination, there's a pastor friend of mine that has 3 kids that all have intersex traits, and they found out that their daughter has a Y chromosome. And so I'm like, this statement that this denomination takes on has no bend room for stuff that they don't see as black and white. And so it was almost like, I'm glad that it happened the weekend I was out there talking to them and interviewing for them, because I'm like, I I look at Jesus's words in Matthew 23, where he says, woe to you, teachers and hypocrites, you slam the door of the kingdom in people's faces. I'm like, this is one of those ways in which you're slamming the door of the kingdom in people's faces. Well, the other thing is that this church was on the same campus of this Christian school I graduated from. And without going into detail on that trip, I was highly dysregulated. It threw me in a tailspin. It put me back into my addictive cycles, put me back into Celebrate Recovery. And in that, I had to walk through a ton of healing. I eventually left that church and landed where I'm at now. And this is a church where the lead pastor is, I was open about everything. I wrestle with everything, and he loves having me here. They love that I'm continually pushing them to care for people that have been hurt by the church. They love that I'm speaking in situations like this podcast we're talking, this conversation we're talking through now. They love some of the creative things that I bring to the table for outreach. They love some of the theological dissonance within our teaching team. There's been times where he's preached something a week after I preached on something. It was a totally different take. And there was one time I apologized. I was like, I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were preaching on that. He's like, David, it's so good for our people, And so it's interesting being in a really healthy place that celebrates. We're running a mental health summit next month for parents and teens, where we're talking about trauma and its effects on mental health. We're helping give tools for parents and families. We opened with partnership with a friend, a counseling center here, and there's all sorts of things that I finally found a niche where I'm in my sweet spot, pastoring people, holding that tension where I'm able to also be open and honest about deconstruction, about religious trauma, about mental health in a way where I know that my lead pastor and the staff and the congregation is behind me. And not all of them agree with me. As a matter of fact, I have a conversation Wednesday in 2 days with somebody over lunch who, me and him, I'm going to push him on something that he said that I think is hurtful and destructive. But I have the freedom to do that without the fear of me being booted out of this place.
Yeah.
So, yeah, man.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm at now. God's, without saying it, I've had to wrestle with where he has been in all of it in my abuse. I've had to wrestle. I've struggled with what that means for prayer. It's like, well, why did you allow the abuse to happen if you're omnipresent and in the room? Can I really come to you and trust you in prayer? And then when I've wrestled with addiction in the past and stuff, it's always the whole well, he didn't really care when I was abused. Why would he care if he's present with me now? And so there's a lot of those wrestles I've had to wrestle with. And I'm open about that stuff. And, and so I feel like I'm at a healthy place, a good place. And my goal is to help support people who have kind of walked through some of the same stuff, and maybe their Christian context doesn't give them freedom to talk about it, and they feel alone and exiled. And
It's awesome. Thank you for sharing. And then 2 questions to wrap up.
Yep.
First one is, what advice would you give somebody? You can even think of it as talking to a younger David. What advice would you give that person who's going on a very similar journey or has walked through similar things as you have? What advice would that be?
Yeah, wow. I think I would tell the 10-year-old, I would give the 10-year-old version of me a hug and tell him that it wasn't his fault. One of the things when you walk through sexual abuse, you battle curiosity, and you battle a sense of, especially as a kid, you're experiencing a type of sexual pleasure that you are not at a mature enough for it to be healthy. So with that comes curiosity, and then with that comes shame. And so the curiosity brings on more shame, and the shame pushes you into more curiosity that is hidden. I would tell myself that it wasn't my fault. I would tell myself as I felt, I had a friend tell me once, he said, you seem like you think you're like Elijah, the lone prophet, and I would tell myself, you're not alone. I began to realize that as people leaned into some of the stuff I was saying and writing.
Yeah.
But I would tell a younger version of me, you're not alone. You don't have to feel alone as an exile. I just didn't know there were other people out there trying to figure things out. Yeah, so that's what I would say.
Yeah, and the last question is, what's one thing you want people to know about you walking away from this conversation?
Yeah. What I would say is if somebody's listening to this, and whether it's sexual abuse in the context of a Christian environment or spiritual abuse within the context of an environment, if you just need somebody to say, "Hey, that happened to me and it sucks," you could reach out to me. I I I could be a listening ear. But I do have access to resources that are helpful and can be helpful. And yeah, I serve on teams and work with different networks of people. And so you don't have to feel alone. Um, uh, my DMs are always available to you if you want to just write me. So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you again for sharing and coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.